Good afternoon, or should I say good evening, everyone. Welcome to our What's Next Community Dialogue session for the Ruby Jones Conference. As people are coming in, we're going to give you a few minutes so that we can get everyone into the webinar, and then we will go ahead and get started. So please bear with us. We're going to give everyone about 2 more minutes to get into the webinar session, and then we're going to go ahead and get started with our What's Next Community Dialogue session. So please bear with us for a few more moments. All right, good afternoon again, everyone. My name is Dr. Demetrius Jaggers, and I am the Senior Director of the Dowdy Multicultural Center. I am excited to be with you all again as we transition into our community dialogue portion of today's conference. And the purpose of today's session is really what we say in the name, and that's that we want to create an opportunity for dialogue to really reflect about some of the things that we have heard and learned over the last 2 days, and to think about what that means for us as members of the Westchester community and the larger surrounding community. And in light of Dr. Davis's words, really our global community. So I have several members of our community that will be joining us for this portion of the conversation. So I want to introduce to you all Nadia Jones, which if you were on the previous session with Dr. Davis, you would have already met Nani. I also want to introduce to you all Dr. Camila Mumi, who is a staff psychologist in our health and our counseling center on campus. I would like to introduce you all to Dr. Casey Borman, who is in our graduate social work department as a associate professor, and also does majority of her work on the Philadelphia campus. And then finally, Dr. Dean Johnson, who is Director of Peace and Conflict Studies. So if you all would come on and join me at this time, and we will go ahead and get our community dialogue session. Throughout this session, there are several questions that we'll be asking, or conversational pieces we'll be asking of the folks who are joining us here in this sort of a roundtable fashion. And we are going to encourage you all as participants to also be a part of thinking about these questions and thoughts, and utilizing the Q&A box to respond to some of the questions. So let's go ahead and get started. Who wants to kick us off?
I will volunteer myself as tribute. That's fine.
So if you all would just provide a brief introduction of who you are, what's your connection to the Westchester community, and kind of what particular experience or perspective you bring to this conversation.
Yeah, no problem. So I can start. Like Dr. Jagger said, my name is Anania Jones, but some of y'all might know me as Nani. I'm a sophomore political science major and Spanish minor on campus, and I'm like involved in a bunch of different things. So you might have seen me be orientation leader or BSU member or multicultural worker, because I'm around campus a lot or on Zoom a lot. But I think the perspective that I share with Dr. Davis's work, in particular, first of all, I'm a young Black woman, and I'm also a radical. At least I consider myself that. Like the opinions that I hold and the things that I want to see happen aren't really what everybody else wants to see happen. So that's me.
And I guess I'll jump in next. Again, my name is Dr. Camilla Mookman. I'm a postdoc psychology resident at the Counseling Center. My background is in clinical psychology, restorative practices, and family systems. And so the lens that I bring to this work is to really understand the importance of healing from racial trauma, white supremacy, and oppression, and also how communities of color, minoritized or marginalized communities really create spaces for belonging, for identity, to celebrate those things, and also to remind ourselves of joy in the process.
I'm Dr. Casey Borman. I'm an associate professor in graduate social work and also the assistant chair and graduate coordinator at our Philadelphia campus. I think I show up at Westchester in a number of different communities, often responding to whatever social issue is emerging at the time. So most recently, I've been working with some folks around the felony background questions on our applications here at Westchester. My research focuses on the intersection between the criminal justice and a range of social service systems. And much of my research was really about, earlier in my career, was about reforming the criminal justice system. And I would say within the last few years, I've come to an abolitionist perspective. So I call myself a baby abolitionist, and that's what particularly brings me to this work.
So my name is Dean Johnson. I'm the Director of Peace and Conflict Studies here on campus. This is my 7th year at being at Westchester. I bring about 25 years of experience as an activist organizer, about 20 years of experience engaging in racial justice, queer justice, and gender justice trainings and work as a part of that. My research initially was in religion and social change, but in the last 10 years, it's been more motivated by understandings of revolutionary nonviolence and community organizing. And so my role at Westchester has been multifaceted. I've been involved with things from putting or having students, hosting students, training students in nonviolence and how to use civil disobedience and how to make social change through that avenue. And I've also seen myself as just an active kind of global citizen on campus in relationship to trying to to bring in the different kinds of components and perspectives, especially talked about and touched on by Dr. Davis in the last session.
Awesome. Thank you all for those introductions. And to everyone who is a part of the conversation, just know that we have enabled the chat feature so you can post your responses, because we, as much as we're going to hear from our members of our community, we want to hear from you all as well. And so really the first thing I wanted to ask folks to share is, what was one major highlight that resonated with you from Dr. Davis's talk this evening?
Well, I'll go ahead. I think there were several kind of reflections that really resonated with me. I was also taking notes, Nani, like I was in class. Like she's just given sort of like a master class in and not only kind of like the politics of revolution, but like how you also kind of walk in grace and just authenticity in that process. And so I'll first start with what I think, impressed me the most, because we don't hear it as often. And there was a question around like, how do you maintain like mental health and in the process, just, what brings you hope, kind of what sustains you. And, she said, Dr. Davis, that one of the questions that she continues to ask herself is, what gives me pleasure? And so whether that's music or being with other people, but she said, Black people have learned how to create beauty in the process of struggle, and that it is our duty to generate this beauty and pleasure as we kind of move through that process. And I thought that was just very refreshing to hear, that, often we feel like there is so much to do and not enough time to do it. But taking those pauses to say, what do I enjoy? What brings me pleasure? What makes me happy while I'm doing this work? And also the beauty that I'm creating on this journey, I think was just such a refreshing and like profound message.
I can share next, and also kind of reiterating what Dr. Jaggers just said. Please put your thoughts in the chat because I would love to see them. But something that really stuck out to me was she said the intellectual aspect of whatever movement is really essential. And I just thought it was interesting because as I said in BSU last night, we were talking about, people like LeBron James or like, Sean King, and how we use these figures as our only means of knowledge. Like we won't know what's happening in this realm if not for LeBron James telling us. And it was really interesting because the conversation that we had, there's people who are like, well, that's just the way it is. Like there's nothing wrong with us following, these people. And I don't think there's anything wrong with it either, because they do have really valuable platforms, and we have to approach these fights from all aspects. But I think it's just really valuable that the leaders that I look up to and the leaders that I follow and the leaders that I think, not even leaders, the people that I feel have generated the most real substantive change, they have all told me to make sure that I'm reading books. So it's kind of like, why would I like genuinely take the word of someone who's not reading a book, who's not doing this work? So that's something that I really thought was interesting, just because last night after that conversation, I'm like, I don't know what the word is, but like, do I discriminate against people who don't have an education? Like, is that me? But it's kind of like, I still don't know the answer to that question. I hope not. I really hope not. But that was just something that's really interesting to me.
Go ahead, Dean, you go, and then I'll.
Okay, well, so I think one of the things that one, I was just in general awe of being in the presence of an elder who has been involved with several revolutionary movements for the last few decades. And so just appreciating the experience and her humility in being able to say, I have not yet arrived either, and I'm still working on that, and giving some of the grace and space for that to happen, and thinking about what does relationship look like, and how do we build into relationships the dynamic that allows us to one, be responsible for one another, and while also being responsible for our own growth, and what's happening around us, but also that kind of sense of just I guess overall grace in doing the work, that we all have edges, and that we're all growing in continue to grow. And if you're going to stay a part of the revolution, then you need to continue to also push yourself to grow and listen, and to be involved with multiple kinds of conversations, not just getting stuck in one kind of isolated way.
So Lydia in the chat kind of stole my quote that stuck out to me, that reform has been the glue that has held these institutions together. And as I mentioned before, a lot of my earlier research was around policing, and I was really interested in how to improve policing interactions with people with mental illnesses. And you know, I think one of the struggles in working towards abolition is what to do with people who are in the system now and are currently experiencing harms from the system at the moment. And so for me, there's, especially as a social worker, there's always this impulse to try to make things better, you know, until we can abolish. But I think that quote really stuck with me, that the reforms not only sustain these institutions, but actually empower them. And they're the things that allow them to continue into perpetuity in different forms, but in a kind of surveilling and controlling nature. And so, I don't know, that really stuck out to me.
So to our participants and attendees, we asked the same question of you all. What was one particular highlight or something that resonated with you from Dr. Davis's talk? And if you would please go ahead and add that in the chat, and we would love to hear from you. Until we have someone, oh, here we go. So Hannah Ashley says, many things that oppressive patterns are bad for white people too. So we have our own investment in ending white supremacy. They're coming in. That
Yeah.
we learned. Go ahead.
I think Mr. Daryl Thomas Jr., I think he was the one who responded to me earlier about my comment about J. Cole. And I just want to clear the air. I don't have anything against J. Cole. I love J. Cole. I listen to him all day long. But he did say at one point, he said, I don't read books. So, I mean, kind of calls into question some things I got. Maybe.
Thank you to everyone who shared so far. I'm going to transition to really the next question. So the question is, what have you found, or do you find most difficult about doing this work? Where are your personal challenges related to doing social justice and racial justice work? And participants, be ready, because we're going to be asking you the same question.
I can start. So as I mentioned before, I think this real tension for me between what the ultimate goal is and what we do right now. I had the Westchester Police Department, not the university, but the borough, a few weeks ago contact me and ask me to work with them on developing a social work position. And I really was torn about whether I wanted to do that, because I thought social workers maybe can improve some of these interactions, but ultimately I just worried about how that position was going to be co-opted and anything that I was going to further do to expand the reach of the police. And so I ended up saying that I'm not the person to do this. And so in that is also, I think, this challenge of like not wanting to center myself as well. I think sometimes when you get called upon to do things, there's always like this thing that's really nice that you're like, oh, you know, I'm the expert, or people really, you know, want me to be involved. And I think particularly when it comes to issues of racial justice or justice around different communities that I'm not directly a part of, I think I always have to be particularly careful about taking on leadership roles. And the other struggle, and I think it's important to share this, especially for folks who are new to racial justice movements, is kind of figuring out how open you can be about your struggles and in what spaces you should be taking up people's time to be open about your struggles. How do you weigh not centering your whiteness and your challenges of being a white person within a racial justice movement, but also making sure that you attend to some of those challenges and do your own kind of mental work? Where do you find the space for those things?
So I'll jump in. I think the reason that I appreciated Dr. Davis's reflection on like pleasure and joy and mental and spiritual health is because I've noticed more recently, especially after the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, George Floyd. I mean, it seems to be like this torrent of names that we can always call. You know, and then also seeing alongside that so many reflections, especially on social media, on Twitter, about people thinking, well, you know, is it time to kind of become an expat, right? Like, can I just live somewhere else where I can find some peace? And you know, and I've thought about that same question for myself, and it's like, oh, I have family in the Caribbean, I have family in Toronto. Like, can I go someplace else? And I found this, Dr. Barnard Hess is a associate professor at Northwestern University. And he tweeted a couple of weeks ago about this idea of Afrocynicism. And he says, it describes the Black feeling of the impossibility of overcoming white supremacy or racial obstacles, combined with the Black feeling of the impossibility of not trying, right? And so, you know, when you're caught between, this is exhausting, and I really have no option other than to continue to resist. You know, it's like, what do you do sort of in that in between, sort of that liminal space? How do you take care of yourself? How do you acknowledge the days that you're just incredibly fatigued and that you deserve rest? And so for me, it has become just acknowledging the tension between, this is work that I really feel called to do and that I'm passionate about and I'm invested in. And that I also deserve to allow myself time to step back and to recuperate, to feel anger. I think often we're at least I have been socialized as a Black woman, you know, to always be strong and to be resilient and to stay focused and, you know, kind of keep marching on. And that often doesn't leave a lot of space for anger and rage to be expressed. And it's a normal part of like human emotion. So for me, the challenge is sort of balancing that cynicism with my commitment and reminders for self-care.
Okay, I can go ahead and share. For me personally, there is nothing not difficult about this work. On so many different fronts, I'm still grappling with how to do it and how to sustain myself. But the things that I find most challenging definitely just include my inability to be everywhere. And even, I don't even want to say this right now because I hate even thinking it. But I honestly don't want to say it, but I was talking to my dad the other day about what's happening in China and concentration camps and, you know, what's going on there, and how frustrated I was that, you know, here I am on Zoom learning and there's this whole tragedy going on over there. And that just doesn't sit right with me. That makes me feel like an awful person. So that's something that I grapple with, just not being able to do everything, and especially not now. But another thing that I grapple with is trying my hardest not to get disillusioned when somebody isn't, as excited as I am. Like, it's hard for me in my I don't even want to say my generation, because maybe I just don't know, maybe I'm not in the right circle, maybe I'm not looking hard enough, but it's kind of frustrating when I see people, just not caring. And it makes me think, maybe because of social media, I'm not sure, but it makes me think that there are so many people that don't care. How could we ever possibly get anything done with this many people that don't care? So that's something that's definitely, I'm trying to overcome that. I just think generally right now, especially considering social media and the many different things that we have to fight with, both here in America and transnationally, as Angela Davis was talking about, it's a lot to stay positive. But then, you get one of those small wins, or you do something and you make somebody else feel inspired, and it's like, yeah, like, I got it. I can keep doing this forever and ever. But yeah.
I also would say that just the general feeling of being overwhelmed a lot of the times, to the point of trying to figure out, okay, where is the best place to go next? That's part of it. I would say that the bigger challenges for me are usually around relationality, and I come out of a Kingian framework in terms of my understanding of nonviolent social change. And so I tend to think a lot about what's called beloved community, and thinking about how do we bring people in and enlarge the beloved community, who is my beloved community, and how am I accountable to those people, so they're going to lift me up when I'm feeling down, but they're also going to call me out on my stuff when I'm not doing what I should be doing, or I'm doing something that they're like, whoa, what just happened there? Like, that's not you, or that's not how we do things. And so there's that part of me. There's also this kind of institutionally, and I think Dr. Davis was touching on some of this, like, how do you build capacity in institutions that are generations old for change? Like, so how do you build like long-term change, especially at a place like Westchester, where we think about the fact that the student body and the administration and lots of the staff members turn over every 5 to 7 years. And so by the time you've started to build some capacity, you lose and have to start over in some ways around some of that. And so I think that's the bigger challenge for me, is how do you maintain the capacity building? But the other thing that I guess I'll say quickly is just also this understanding of when to take leadership and when to step back in that, as and I don't. So the danger in having a conversation like this is trying not to center whiteness, but I feel like there's something that I've called damnable ambiguity in the midst of some things, because when you look like the oppressor, when you benefit from the oppression, whatever that oppression is, you can gain allies and you can become an ally and you can be recognized as an ally in a certain context. But when you step out of that context, you are still that oppressor and you still look like the oppressor and you still benefit from that. And so in some ways, stepping into some roles is difficult, because it's like, who should be doing that? I could be doing that, but at the same time, I don't want to take the leadership away from someone else or center it on myself. And so it becomes this kind of, what I would say, damnable space that's very ambiguous to step in at times, to think about. And I don't want to say that as an oh, poor me sort of thing, because I definitely am not dealing with that at a paralyzing level, but I can see where some people get so overwhelmed that they're like, yeah, what's next? And so how do you stay charged and energized in that kind of space too?
Dean, if I could just respond to you really quickly, because I think I've saw, especially in the conversations around the protests that happened over the summer, it's like you're seeing huge thousands of people protesting in predominantly white cities, right? And so, this is, perhaps slightly different than what we saw before. And that there being conversations about, even in those predominantly white cities, there are Black activists, right? There are people of color who are leading those movements. And so what are the honest conversations we have about how uncomfortable it might be to to turn over power when you're so accustomed to it, right? And sort of accustomed to deference or being seen as the expert, and really taking the lead from those who are directly impacted to say, you know, what do you need me to do, right? And in those instances, and I was listening to a segment on NPR, it's like, well, put your body between these Black bodies and the officers, right? Because they will think twice about, you know, perpetrating violence against you, that there's a way you can kind of interrupt that. And for some to say, all right, those are my marching orders, right? And for others to say, well, I think there's something more, right, I could be doing. So I think there's always this tension between how am I reflecting on my positionality? How am I reflecting on what it feels like to divest from power as I know it? And then what does it feel like for that person of color, that Black person, you know, to say, I should be leading in this way. And it is only white supremacy that causes me to question whether or not I'm capable of doing it.
Yeah, I have a question for y'all because I didn't really understand this part. I probably should have asked Mrs. Davis herself, but I was kind of nervous. She was talking about white people not being afraid to take leadership from Black people, and I didn't really understand what she was trying to say. Because at one point she was talking about how white people, at least in my opinion, I've seen, you know, white people have this tendency to like want to take over things. And I don't really know what she was getting at. So maybe one of you could clarify that for me.
I don't know if I heard that part. I got on about 10 minutes in. So was that a statement that she made kind of early in her talk?
No, it was later, but it was something I remember because she said it a couple of times, like white people cannot be afraid to take leadership from Black people. And I don't know what it meant.
So what she's saying, if my understanding of that is that white people need to let Black people and people of color tell them what they need to do. Like they need to step back out of the leadership roles. So it's not take leadership from those people, but allow them to be the leaders in the movement for their own revolutionary causes as a part of that. That's how I understood what she was saying.
That would make a lot more sense. Thank you.
So being receptive to direction and wisdom and guidance from, you know, those minoritized communities, and not feeling kind of the impulse to say, well, perhaps I could do this differently, right? So kind of like questioning.
Thank you all for those responses, and I want to continue to encourage other individuals who are listening to engage. And I don't know if as you all are looking at the chat, if there's specific things that you would like to raise or respond to from folks who are participating. All right, so was someone gonna?
Yeah, I was gonna make a comment. Because somebody put in the chat, people don't care often because of our individualistic society and capitalism. And that's actually Angela Davis, her most recent book, Freedom is a Constant Struggle. She talked a lot about individualism and how that's been so detrimental to who we are in our movements, because movements have to be collective. You know, it's a collective thing, yet we have this individualistic society. So it's kind of like a really big contradiction. But I think that's definitely a part of why people don't, well, I don't even want to say don't feel the need, because I don't know everybody. So maybe I'm just not looking in the right places. But from what I'm seeing, I think definitely our individualistic society and the way that we've been programmed to think that we are all that there is, you know, America is all that there is. I think that's definitely a part of the reason why so many people don't care about things that are happening in Palestine or things that are happening in Brazil. And I didn't even know anything was happening in Brazil. So I definitely have research to do now. But I think it's also, when I think about it, there has been so much work that has been done to keep people from realizing their own agency. And I think that's something that's really big. I don't even want to say just in America, but I've been giving presentations to different classes about voting and stuff. And even within my own home, when I hear people talk about nothing is going to change. Nothing is going to change. And Angela Davis said this herself. And that's how I'm always so happy to hear her talk, because it's kind of like she takes the words out of my mouth. Like, it's weird. But she was saying, you know, voting might not be the change, but we can be. So it's kind of like, you know, of course, I'm not going to put my faith in any politician and do something because I can do it. It's like, you know, we have to recognize that not even just we can do it, you know, as a collective. So I think people aren't recognizing that, and people are just so, I'm not going to say complacent, but people believe that what they have is all that they can possibly have. And they've been taught that. I've been taught that. So I definitely think that there's a reason for that, that I definitely think we have to be aware of when we're talking about it.
Yeah, I think, you know, what I wrote down, actually, what she said, you know, I'm voting, because she was talking about kind of the aftermath of the presidential debate. And Dr. Davis said, I'm voting for our capacity to continue to make change, to guarantee that our movements, right, can continue to be transformative. So, you know, not voting for one individual, but how can we sort of keep this space open for us to continue to challenge, right? She said, whoever is in the occupant of the White House. And that feeling of either resignation or lack of agency is sort of the bread and butter of white supremacy, right? As long as you've internalized that sense that you have no power, you have no ability to affect change, then this is the machinery that will continue. And so you always see alongside sort of this awakening or consciousness, increased violence, right? Increased suppression, like even now with voter suppression, you know, what's happening in Florida with felons who should be able to vote, but now have these sort of ambiguous fees and are being disenfranchised. So I think being able to continue to remind ourselves of what can I do locally, what can I do, just what education can I provide even within my family, right? And seeing that as important work, right? It's not sort of this large scale, you know, everyone knows what I'm doing kind of work, but if I can get my aunties and my grandma and, you know, all of the people that can vote, if I can get them there, then I'm also sort of advancing this mission, and that's important as well.
Awesome, thank you. So next question, what challenges do you all think exist? And this is directly to those who are participating and listening. What challenges do you think exist at WCU related to addressing systemic racism and creating a more inclusive campus culture? What challenges currently exist at WCU that poses barriers to addressing systemic racism and creating a more inclusive campus culture?
I think, in my opinion, as a student, I think one of the biggest challenges that I personally face is social media. It's hard to get people. It's hard to get, because again, I'm not. Angela Davis in part taught me this, but I'm not going to depend on any institution that has historically not been for me to suddenly be for me. That's something that I have to do. Maybe they can do that eventually and promote my well-being, but you know, I think that that's our job as college students to do that. But I think social media definitely prevents us from looking up. You know, like when I'm even walking to class, you know, people are on their phones. You can't create that community that Dr. Dean Johnson was talking about. You can't create that community when nobody's even looking at each other. Like you just can't do that. So I definitely think social media, I mean, it's a plus, but it's also been a problem, especially it's been a big barrier that I've been trying to break down and face myself.
I guess I would say that some of the biggest barriers that I see on campus and having been on campus now for 7 years. So I've been on it for a while. The first couple of years are always a blur in a new place because you're trying to figure out what the systems are and where the levers are and those sort of things. But what I've noticed is that frequently the clarity of narrative of what we're trying to accomplish isn't there. Like there isn't we're going to own this as our ongoing problem that we need to take our lumps on and also embrace. And I think there's been more of that this academic year so far than what we've seen in previous years. But I'm just saying, if we want to set up a different cultural understanding, a different way of being with one another on campus, then there needs to be some clear, this is what the environment's going to look like, and this is the environment we want it to be. And it also means that, honestly, we've seen in recent years the disappearing of several more radical voices at levels of faculty and staff disappear from campus, either because they couldn't make it, like they felt like this is too frustrating and I need to move on, or their contracts weren't renewed in several locations. So I worry about, again, the kind of consistency of where the narrative is coming from, and that, several steps forward or a couple steps forward and then several back every time we have to restart institutionally with a new person in a new position, and what that means and what that looks like.
Well, I think because this is my second year at Westchester, I think I can speak to, I've worked at different universities in sort of this counseling capacity. So I guess my perspective is kind of gleaned from what seems to be a theme across campuses. And Dr. Davis said, how do we cultivate the dissatisfaction of the university as it exists, right? Like, what are we agitating for? And I think, like you said, Dr. Johnson, like, what are we also envisioning as, where we're moving to? So not simply like what needs to be reformed, abolished, right, done away with, but what are we actively seeking as a different vision for what the campus could be? And in that, she also said, like, we can't assume that diversity and inclusion is enough, right? That those things have been embraced by institutions without the necessary self-reflection, right? And so, creating an office, hiring a director, and they're like, oh, boom, we did it, we're good, right? And so to kind of be pushed on, well, this isn't even starting at square one. Like, you're just sort of, you're doing the preparatory work. And so I think this impatience and discomfort with how difficult the process is in making those kind of systemic changes, and the commitment to the longevity, right? And so what happens when those radical voices, which we need, right? We need people who are saying, oh, we're not done. we have so much more to do, are really pushed out. And often that is because they're making people uncomfortable who have decided that it is sufficient to do the superficial work. And when they're pushed out, there isn't the historical memory of folks who are saying, no, remember, we tried this before and it really didn't work. So maybe let's do something different. And so I think there's always at least the expressed desire for the change to happen, and then the overwhelming discomfort of what it would require. And it requires that self-reflection that becomes at times either just completely absent or very intellectualized. And so we can have talks, we can have debates, but when it comes to, well, how are we treating our Black and brown cafeteria workers, right? Then it's like, oh, well, this is not what we're talking about, right? And so I think, just being able to push on an individual and collective level, I guess expectations about how change is supposed to unfold, and that it is a lifelong process and not something that one initiative or one office will be able to do in 4 years.
I think we need to be leery of the discourse of civility that we often hear on our campus. On the surface, it seems really neutral, logical, but I think it's often used to stifle the reactions of people who have experienced a range of different oppressive forces and discredit what they're saying or doing because we don't like the way they're doing it or the tone of how they're doing it. So I think, yeah, I have trouble bringing it back around, but that's often in a lot of campus emails, and I'd like us to just think more critically about what that means and who suffers a little bit when we focus too much on dynamics of civility.
There's a comment that I wanted to read. Thank you all for those thoughts. It says, I also feel that the radical voices are silenced, not only from up down, but also pushback from the students that are a microcosm of US society. So a little bit of reflection about the ways in which not only there are challenges within the system, as in, you know, staff, faculty, administrators, but also the larger community where there may be resistance to change and progress.
There's a bunch of comments in the chat that I think are definitely worthy of addressing. But in addressing the comment about radical voices being pushed down, me personally, I don't think that there's even an opportunity for people to find their radical voice at school. And I guess Angela Davis was touching on that when she said there's a lot of, you have to educate yourself outside of school. Everything that I've learned, the person I've been shaped to become, none of those things have been taught to me in a classroom. Yeah, I definitely gained some knowledge about how politics work and what I have to tear down in the future. But when it comes to why I would even have to tear that down in the first place, knowing that these institutions have to go, that was done by me reading Angela Davis, and none of my teachers assigned me her books. So it's kind of like, there's no way for people to even discover that they are radicals at school. You know, there aren't, I honestly don't even know anybody. Again, maybe I'm not in the right circles, but I don't see these conversations happening. BSU is a great place to have conversations about, you know, race relations, but on a, listen, we got to abolish the police, or on a abolish the prison system, or on America, you know, where the police are just, I forgot the exact wording, but the Black Panther Party's hypothesis that the police are an occupational force of America and in the Black community, we're not talking about those things on that level, that intellectual level that Angela Davis was talking about. So I definitely just don't even think there's that opportunity for people to grow into that thought process, or for people to even be introduced to it.
Another comment from the chat relates to the fact that the Latinx community and Hispanics are not included in enough conversations about race relations. And so, speaking to the broader point, really, that Dr. Davis talked about, you know, what does it mean to think about liberation for all, you know, not just Black folks, and not to think about race as a dynamic between Black and white people, but to think about our Latinx, Indigenous, Asian American brothers and sisters. And so I would, if you all have any specific thoughts or responses to that, because to me that seems to be a challenge, you know. So what does it look like to broaden that conversation?
I think that what we often have to be mindful of and also careful about is flattening our own identities and assuming that, you know, we're only allowed to sort of access one part of ourselves. And so as a Black Muslim woman, right, that, what I think a lot about is racial and gender oppression, but also Christian hegemony and Christian privilege. And so when I'm sort of bringing all of myself to a conversation, I'm also curious about how I might flatten someone else. And so, you know, there's a lot of conversations about race within the Latinx community, and especially from Afro-Latinx people who are saying, there are ways that we are experiencing anti-Blackness within, right, our ethnic community, and then, you know, experiencing exclusion in other places. And so I think we're all sort of internalized kind of like this literal sort of black and white binary, but knowing that people are bringing so much of themselves, you know, in terms of their multiple identities. And so when we're assuming, at least from my perspective as a Black Muslim, there are ways in which I'm excluded from conversations about the African American community because of the assumption of Christianity, and then excluded from conversations about American Muslims because of the assumption that most are Arab or South Asian. And so I think being able to sort of be open to understanding how we flatten people, how we limit them to just one identity that can be salient, only one at a time. And then how we can kind of fall into the trap of then saying, well, no, you're not including, when really it's about the language that we're using to think about, right, who communities are and what they represent.
To continue on that point, my dad is actually Puerto Rican and my mom is Black. And so it's really interesting that you bring up that binary that we have in society, just because in my family, I know that there's a lot of things that go on, because my grandmother on my dad's side, she's white passing, and you know, she speaks Spanish, whatever. And I remember one day I asked her about, you know, our Puerto Rican roots, and she looks at me and she laughs and she says, "Ours?" And I'm like, grandma, what? I'm your granddaughter. But it's like, it's just kind of one of those things where there's definitely a lot of discussions to be had. And I think what that's going to, we have to communicate. And what Angela Davis was saying, I think that we should focus on is our struggles they're all intertwined. So it's kind of like, you know, we have to recognize that there are so many different links between anti-immigration policies and anti-Black policies. You know, there are so many different links between these things. And I think that we would benefit from recognizing that. So when I do hear either people in the Hispanic community or people in the Black community denouncing or disregarding in any way people of the other community, it's kind of really baffling to me, because I think I'm coming to understand that, you know, we're kind of two peas in the same pod, if that makes sense. Because a lot of our struggles are linked, and they come from the same thing. And honestly, you know, there's a lot of Afro-Latinas in a lot of these different places. So it's kind of like a lot of our struggles are the exact same, not even two peas in the same pod, they're the same pea. So it's kind of like we have to get to that understanding. And I think that understanding is lacking in every community, it's lacking. And I think that's purposeful too, because, you know, it's divide and conquer. So.
Thank you for sharing that, Nani. I think one of the ways that has been helpful for me to think about the interconnectedness of the struggle for liberation is to think about white supremacy specifically as the roots of a tree and really the trunk of a tree, and then think about the various branches that live off that tree, whether we're talking about sexism, misogyny, homophobia, when we talk about the experiences of poor people and the trans community, you know, it all is rooted in this idea of white, male, cisgender normativity. And so I think it's important that we realize the connection across the struggle. And I'm trying to recall where this quote comes from, and I can't think of the person, but essentially, you know, none of us are free until we're all free. So how do we embrace that? I'm looking at back at the chat, and there's a comment. I will point to a culture of silence around the ways intersecting systems of oppression operate on our campus specifically. We talk about things in the abstract or historically, but not specifically and in the present day. And to me, that is connecting to what I often call how do we localize these conversations around systemic racism, structural racism. You know, we can talk about it as it relates to global or the international context or even the national context, but what does it mean right in our community, in our neighborhood, on our college campus? And I think to Cindy's point, that's what we're talking about. How do we stop talking about these ideas in abstract ways and really begin to talk about them and listen to the people who are experiencing the trauma on a day-to-day basis? Any thoughts or reflections from you all about that?
Dane, you look like you have a thought.
I do. I was sitting here thinking a couple of thoughts. So in my time at Westchester, one of the things that happened pretty early on, following the death of Michael Brown, and then not the non-indictment of Darren Wilson for killing Michael Brown. Some of the conversations that came out of that with students led to a training of a group primarily made up of Black and queer women, students on campus, who ended up identifying themselves as a group that would lead almost weekly kinds of demonstrations on campus, who had written up a list of demands, who had said, we're connected with these 20 organizations on campus. It was called the Black Friday Coalition. And they did a lot of work in 2014, 2015, trying to do some of that conversational coalition building. And again, what we saw happen was several of them then graduated and the conversation wasn't really picked up in quite the same way. So I'm saying that's a student-led initiative. Some faculty and staff were also heavily involved and invested in that. And I think one of the things that I try to talk some with student groups especially about, and how we think about organizing on campus and community building on campus, is that we do a lot of siloing on our own. That we have, this group is going to do this activity, and these groups are doing these activities, and what we don't do is a whole lot of I'm going to make sure my people go to your thing, and I want to make sure your people come to my thing, because we're all the same people, right? And so when we're doing this together, that's what the coalition building looks like. But why is somebody going to show up at your event if you were never going to their stuff and participating in their event? So part of that coalition building is breaking down those walls that have been set up institutionally, I think, that say, oh, well, there is this, there's this group who deals with this thing. There's this group who does this thing. And if we fall into those trappings, it kind of, in some ways, perpetuates this divide and conquer mentality, because we become very focused on ourselves and not so much like, how do we build this together in a different way and say, I have your back, you have my back, because we're all in this together. And if we can get this thing to move in this direction, and I'll go back to something Ananya said earlier about the overwhelming sense of what movement work looks like and kind of the inching. There's lots of good research to show that if you only need to swing 4% of the population in your direction to get real change to happen in many places. When you think about what that looks like at Westchester, right? 4% of the population. If you can get 4% of the student body to show up for anything, you have a massive group of people that's going to get listened to, you know, all at once showing up, because even 30 or 40 people who are making their voices heard can get listened to on campus. So I just wanted, that was my thought in terms of thinking about the building up of again, this kind of sense of working together and coalescing collaboratively.
I want to bring attention to a question that was in the chat from one of our Rockstar social work students about the role of leadership for folks who are half white and what that looks like, particularly given issues of colorism and the way that people of certain skin tones can be privileged in certain spaces. And I'm curious if the other panelists have thoughts on that.
I was also thinking about that question that was posed in the chat. And I think a really good place to start for many of us is acknowledging both, our privileges and advantages, and also the ways in which we may be disadvantaged, right? And so, knowing for me, I didn't share this earlier, but I'm originally from Brooklyn, New York. I have an Ivy League background. I was, a first generation college student. And so I was always having to kind of reconcile the fact that, when I'm on the campus of the University of Pennsylvania, right, I look a certain way, I'm presenting a certain way. But then when I'm going back home to Brownsville, Brooklyn, right, I'm also the person who went to college, who went to an Ivy League school, right, who now has a doctorate. And what opportunities and advantages have I also gained from that exposure and networking and experience? And so for me to kind of deny that I'm privileged in a certain way is also kind of emblematic of privilege, like to say, no, I don't have it. I do. And so I think in particular, when thinking about, biracial folks or multiracial folks who identify as Black, or who might be, I think as Nani said, people who are white passing, where do I fall again, kind of in this binary, is to think about, right? How am I advantaged by colorism, right? How can I use that privilege or leverage it towards the goal of the movement? And how can I also reconcile that there may be kind of hurt and pain because of my personal experience as a biracial person, but do I center that, right? Or I figure out, like, how can I be best useful to this movement? And from my own kind of personal experiences, I think it's a really difficult conversation to have, because it's often has sort of like internally, right? Like, how do Black folks specifically talk about colorism, right? To talk about how that hierarchy, right, is so steeped in enslavement. And so kind of talking about it in, kind of like in front of company, so to speak, it feels really awkward. And so I think really creating the spaces to say, we need this affinity space to now kind of drill down and to talk about what are some of the tensions and the conflicts that we haven't given sufficient time to, right, as we kind of push back against white supremacy. So within the Black and African American community, I would say that is conversations around colorism, around Christian privilege, right, around capitalism, and how that shows up in kind of like Black bourgeois spaces. So I think it's always kind of knowing where you are and how you're showing up, how you're presenting, and what are your intentions, right? What are your motivations in that space?
I kind of want to make 2 points, so bear with me if it's kind of long. Wait, Dr. Jeffers, do you have something to say?
I was just gonna connect with what Dr. Camila just said, in that the importance of really exploring and understanding our own privilege, because it's hard for us to try to join a movement or join, this process of change if we're still struggling. Not to say that you have to be perfect, because none of us are perfect. We're still trying to figure things out. But from my own perspective, one of the things that I've had to really come to terms with and to interrogate is what it means to be a Black man and to operate in my male privilege and what that means in terms of how I've been socialized to think about being a man and or masculinity, and then what does that mean for the ways in which I show up for Black women, for women of color, for women in general. How am I interrogating my own maleness and utilizing my own privilege, um, and dealing with that before I can really step into a place of being an ally or accomplice or being one to join, the fight for um, feminism and things of that nature. So I think that is really critical.
I wanted to make 2 points. The first of which, firstly, as you could probably tell, I'm very light skinned. So that's I definitely feel the same types of, can I take this role? Can I take this role? But I think what I'm still coming to terms with is that kind of like what Angela Davis said, a lot of us are vested in this fight. We all, regardless, we all have something to give to it. And just me personally, other than my grandma, we're the lightest in the family. So I have 10 nieces and nephews, and all of them, none of them are light skinned. All of them are very brown, very beautiful. And then I have my brother. I have a bunch of different siblings, and all of them are very brown, very beautiful. I have a brown mom. I have a brown dad. And it's kind of like, if I'm not even, I understand I have a lot of layers of privilege that I can definitely use. And also that I definitely need to recognize when I need to step back and let somebody else talk. But I also understand that, at least I grew up in a predominantly white high school. So for me, transitioning from a predominantly Black elementary school to me going to that predominantly white middle school and high school, I definitely recognized and began to recognize that I'm Black. Because kind of when you go to a predominantly Black school, that's kind of all you know. So I didn't even know I was Black until I really started getting around white people and recognized that I was different. But that understanding, and I'm not sure this doesn't necessarily apply to everyone who's biracial or everyone who is light skinned, but they kind of told me, you don't look white. I can tell that you're not white, so I'm going to treat you this way. So that definitely kind of is what made me vested in the way that I am. Just knowing that, I definitely have a real legitimate stake in this, if not for myself, then for my very beautiful, very Black, very great family. But there was also a point in the chat about young people and the appreciation of intergenerational relationships. And me personally, I'm 19 years old, and talking to older people is something that I find really difficult, just because, as Angela Davis said, a lot of them think because we did it this way, you have to do it this way. And I just don't think that makes a lot of sense, because we are still fighting this fight. So doesn't that mean something has to change? Doesn't that mean that we have to do something more? So I just find it generally really difficult for me to and maybe it's something I have to get better at, because I do think older people have a lot to contribute to myself and my growth. But it's difficult for me to even put myself in a situation for an adult to tell me, no, we just need reform. And for them to try to indoctrinate me, you're wrong about defunding, you're wrong about abolishing, we don't need that. Because why would I sit here and let you take my light away? Like, that's just really, that doesn't sit right with me. And I find that to happen with a lot of older people. So, yeah.
So thank you for that. And as we come to the end of our time, I wanted to get this last question in, and I think it's a great question for us to end on. And this is to our roundtable guests, as well as those of you who are still with us. Based on what you heard from Dr. Davis and from other presenters thus far, what steps do we need to take individually and collectively to see change on our campus? What steps do we need to take individually and collectively to see change? And it looks like there's a question that maybe somebody can include this question in their response. How do you work together when everything folks see and experience is not to trust you?
That I thought, I'm not exactly sure who the you is, like not to trust you as a member of the faculty or staff. I don't know, Cindy, if you could just offer that clarification. Just speaking from my role in the counseling center, I think individually and collectively, what we are thinking about and really developing for our students of color is healing spaces. So that often it is the most marginalized students that are called on to do the most labor, and how that activism then impacts their academic performance. You know, they're often also kind of in financially sort of tenuous positions as well. And so doing great work and not getting sort of the institutional, financial, and mental health support needed to sustain that work. And so within the counseling center, like in a coalition with Dr. Cindy and Gender and Equity, with the Dowdy Multicultural Center, really thinking about how do we create that nurturing and restorative space, healing space for students of color, so that they can understand that when they're feeling those racial microaggressions, you know, the fatigue, you know, really feeling kind of like a bodily assault in some ways, like a physical reaction to how assaulted they may be, both verbally and emotionally, by white supremacy. There is a validation that is emotionally taxing, and being able to then develop coping strategies to individually, and again, kind of on a community level, think about the best way forward. So I, you know, am committed to making sure that, especially in collaboration with students, to Nani's point, you know, telling us what you need because we trust your wisdom, and then being able to, with our resources and, you know, differences in power, be able to provide that for you because you are in a different, you know, probably a different perspective that would be incredibly invaluable. But if you're so tired that you can't really, you know, kind of develop the cognitive, you know, space to really put that into action, we might all just kind of not benefit from what you bring. So I definitely think the healing spaces are necessary.
If I can build off that, I guess I have something that Angela Davis said was that, like, safety and security don't have to be left in the hands of the carceral system. So just thinking about on our campus, like how we create a campus that feels safer for folks, and what that might look like without necessarily relying on campus safety, or without relying on these screening questions in our admissions process that are really biased against folks with disabilities, folks who come from low income communities, folks who are Black and brown. I think there's a false idea that if we can just like ask all these questions about people's criminal backgrounds, and, you know, then all of a sudden we can create this safe campus, being blind to all the ways in which violence takes place, both on that interpersonal level, but also on an institutional level.
A couple things come to mind. One, building a bit off of what Dr. Borman was just saying in relationship to, like, I think we got to call things what they are when we see them. And so just thinking about, why do we call it campus safety when they're actually police? They come to campus with armed, they're armed, they're police. If you're arrested by them, it's a for real arrest. It's not like it is on a small campus where maybe security people. So I just want to put out there that, like, some of how we work to name things makes a big difference in what that reality looks like. If we don't name things as a real threat, then it's easy to kind of push them away, I think. think I'll go back to what I said earlier, institutionally. Just clear statements about this is what we do as a part of education, that you're not just coming here to get kind of a job training sort of thing, but 80% of the work that you're doing while you're a student is working with and through and around and all those sort of things with these conversations. Like that's an important part of what we do in the work. So I think what I'm thinking about in terms of actual other things we might do. I know as a faculty member, I'll speak as a faculty member, it's been important for me to try to make sure that the students who show up in my class see themselves reflected in the things that they're learning. That means that I know I have all kinds of students in my classroom spaces, and how are they represented in the syllabus that I say is what everyone should be learning about in my classes. So that's one thing that I think, why would people show up for your class if they don't think there's anything in the syllabus for them to learn about themselves or about the other people that are around them? And then the other thing I think I'd go back to is something that I hear from Elder Ruby Sales a lot when she's been speaking at similar sorts of things. And that is that she has noticed this pattern, and I've noticed it on other campuses that I've been a part of, that that you don't have to wait to learn everything before you can get involved and do things, right? So the part of what happens in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Black Panther Party is, we need this thing done, and if somebody doesn't know how to do it, somebody will quickly figure out how to do it, and we'll move on with the next thing that needs to be done. But you can't wait for everybody to show up, and you can't think that you're going to know everything before you can start to get involved, because most movements are people made up of 17 to 24-year-olds, right? That's the masses that we see out and about. So I think some of those institutional and individual kind of recognitions, and people just pondering, what do I have to still learn, and how do I not get trapped in my own stuff all the time?
To go off of that, I think there's a lot that we can do, despite my earlier pessimistic thoughts about how we can't do everything. There's definitely a lot that we can do. I think, I'm not trying to be really self-promoting right now, but I am a part of a book club, and we do read a lot of radical things. We actually read Angela Davis's Freedom is a Constant Struggle, and that Instagram is read_revolutionize_repeat. So read, revolutionize, repeat. Really cute name. But so if you're interested in that, I think that's definitely one of the ways that we can all educate ourselves while also radicalizing ourselves. And just generally, even if not in that form, I think one of the best things that we can all be doing right now is reading and researching and learning from the several movements of the past, and recognizing, what necessarily didn't happen that maybe should have happened, what we can learn from. I personally think there's so many really good things that we can learn from the Black Panther Party. And I think that they were so effective, which is why our FBI actually killed so many of them, because they were so very much effective. But I think, kind of going off that, we definitely have to begin developing community-oriented mindsets. So getting in your community, helping your community, especially right now, there are so many people that need help. So many people, whether it be homework help, whether it be food, and there are people providing those resources. So finding them and getting in touch with them, or, doing something in your own community. I really do think that there's a bunch of different things you can be doing right now, no matter where you are. But definitely one of the biggest things, I think, probably the first step that I took was buying a book. That was the first step that I took. So I'm not saying that anybody else has to take that same step, but I think that a lot of college students would really benefit, especially in a school where we don't have that outlet to grow and to learn what other people did. Just reading and researching what other people did is a really great mechanism. And also talking to each other. I think communication is really key right now, if not even for the sake of work like this, but just for our own sanity. It can be really hard to, get in touch with people. And personally, I'm an extrovert, so I struggle with not talking to people. But I definitely think communicating and reaching out, and if anybody ever needs to reach out to me, please feel free. I'm always here to talk and listen and anything. So. I mean, I definitely love to hear what y'all have been doing in the chat, or even like y'all, like what have y'all been doing over the summer? It's been a very eventful summer for myself, but I would love to hear what y'all have been doing. Or even a book recommendation if you have one.
I do have a book recommendation. And it is called The Art of Holding Space, a practice of love, liberation, and leadership. So I'll just do my Vanna White right here if you can see it. My screen. But it's the author's name is Heather Plett, I think it's pronounced, Plett. Again, The Art of Holding Space. I'll put it in the chat. But that's, one of the things that's important for me is being able to talk about The Cycle of Liberation by Dr. Bobby Harrow is also related to this, that at the center of that liberation is joy, is love, is compassion. And so while we're fighting what seems like seemingly insurmountable sort of obstacles, that as Dr. Davis mentioned, bringing in that beauty, the joy, the pleasure, just being able to appreciate the fact that we are together, especially in light of how COVID has impacted many communities of color, people in general, but those who are most vulnerable, that we might have all experienced losses in different ways over the last 6 months. And so not taking for granted, the ability to reach out and connect with folks. My mother would always teach us that if someone came to mind, you're thinking like, oh, I wonder how so-and-so is doing, that meant you should reach out to them and like, whatever, call them, email, text, send a letter, because that person came to mind for a reason. And so that is sort of an aspect that I think is important, that as we do so much work, we're also just kind of appreciating the joy of being with one another and having those really nourishing relationships.
One book recommendation that I have not read, but it's on my list that I'm looking forward to getting to once I finish a couple of books that I'm reading now. It's a recent book. It's called Caste, the Origins of Our Discontents by Isabella Wilkerson. It's a great book about just overall caste systems and what that has done to the ways in which we experience division. And so it's on my list, and maybe somebody will read it before I do and can enlighten me on some of the things that I might hear and see once I read it. Well, we are at 7 o'clock, and I know that some of us have been looking at a computer screen or cell phone or whatever device, or maybe even listening on the phone for several hours now. And I want to just say that we appreciate everyone's ongoing engagement. If you're just joining us today, thank you for being here. If you've been here with us since yesterday, then we hope that you will join us tomorrow for our final session, and hope that everyone would have a great night, and that the conversations that we begin here will not stay here, but they will continue as we continue to do this work. So thank you all. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And in the event that you are here to get extra credit, go ahead and use the QR code and the link to get credit for that.